A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Christian social commentator David Robertson is back with us. He's also minister at Scott's Kirk Presbyterian Church in Newcastle, New South Wales, and he's the insightful blogger, theWeFlea.com. David Robertson, a special welcome back to 2020.
Yeah, it's good to be back with you. I was amused. Tim Costello, a national treasure, which I agree, and I'm a wee irritant, which I also agree with. So, you're going from the sublime to the ridiculous. That's great.
You know what? Irritation is one of those things I think, if you're going to stand for truth, someone's going to be irritated significantly by that. And, you might get things right, you might get things wrong, but having a little bit of backbone to be able to stand up and at least express your opinion and the reason why you hold that opinion is a very powerful thing. Hey, David, it's getting harder and harder for someone with a deeply held Christian moral ethic to be held in high esteem if they're going to stand for public office. This is something that's developing in your homeland in Scotland. Give us a little insight here into how this picture looks.
Okay, well, we've been here before with a woman called Kate Forbes, who is, most people reckon, the most gifted politician, certainly in the Scottish National Party. And she stood for election last year and she was roundly denigrated to be First Minister, and she almost won it. Now, what she predicted about her opponent, Humza Yousaf, was that he wouldn't last, and he hasn't lasted, he's gone. And so there's going to be another election. Whether she stands or not, I don't know. But the very thought of her becoming the First Minister of Scotland has some in the media in just fits, really. And there's an extraordinary article in the Times, of all things, by a man called Kenny Farquharson, who, let me just quote you a little of what he says. He recognises Forbes has ideas and energy. She has a vision of how to build Scotland for the challenges of the age. She's very gifted, etc., etc., etc. But then he says, whoever leads Scotland next, it can't be Kate Forbes. Kate Forbes is unfit to be First Minister of a 21st century Scotland, a 1920s Scotland maybe, a 1950s Scotland perhaps, but not Scotland in 2024. Now, he celebrates at the same time Humza Yousaf being the first Muslim Prime Minister in the West. But this Presbyterian woman, absolutely not. She will, and he then paints a picture of her, which actually includes lies. I mean, ironically, the Scottish Parliament just passed a thing on hate crime. So I basically reported him to the police for hate crime, just use their own weapons. But it's an extraordinary thing. And I think in Australia, you get people saying, well, I think that forget Scott Morrison's politics at one level. That's what people should be talking about. But people focused on his Christianity. I think people, if you've got politicians like Lyle Shelton or whatever, I think if a politician was to come out with what used to be normal views we'd call socially conservative, saying marriage is between a man and a woman, or men can't become women, or even opposing abortion, they're automatically now labelled far right and beyond the pale. And even those in the Liberal Party will say, no, we can't have this person, it's too extreme. And yet these are the teachings of Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant churches, and not just the churches, many others as well hold to them. So it's a very interesting situation where nobody would dare say, because you're a Muslim, you cannot be a political leader in Australia. But in Scotland, certainly it is the case. And I wonder if we're moving this direction in Australia, that being a committed Christian who actually believes the Bible would exclude you from public office.
We'll see if we can get onto that, because I know you like to, you made a big deal of the hypocrisy of people who might hold the view that you can't have a Christian but you can have a Muslim, and some of the ways that those ethics it's just a position of hypocrisy so obvious. And I do want to be able to follow up too with the fact that you've made a complaint and made an accusation about a hate crime to this particular fellow Farquharson. But let me just ask you here, because it would appear that anyone who holds to a Christian faith, they get relegated to an age of the past. You're saying, a candidate of the 19th century. or being aligned with those awful right-wing Republicans in the US. This is the sort of thing. The easiest way to dismiss someone is to align them with someone who already, in the public eye, has got some sort of stigma. Thoughts here on the way that the politics works?
Well, it's the stigma part of it. So, it's such an unintelligent piece. In fact, the article itself has done Kate Forbes a lot of good because so many people are horrified at it. I know, for example, of one senior BBC producer who's an atheist who thought it was absolutely disgusting. But you see, the two things are not that you, as a journalist, would ever try to be clever, but this guy's trying to be a clever journalist, and he thinks it's witty. So let's just take the two issues you mentioned. One is a 1920s Scotland or a 1950s Scotland. Well, sorry, what's wrong with the 1950s? Why such chronological snobbery? And where did we get this view that if you're in the 2020s, somehow you're in a more advanced, progressive and better society? I think there's a lot of us who wouldn't think that. And I don't think it, because I actually think we are regressing. We're not regressing to the 1950s. We are regressing to the 050s. We're regressing to the Greco-Roman pagan view of things. And I just think this kind of snobbery, oh, you're so old-fashioned, well, I don't know. What are they, records, turntables and so on. I was told when I had my albums and my LPs, oh, you're so old-fashioned, they're so out of date. Now they're worth a fortune, they're coming back. So maybe Christian morality will come back. I think that is part of it. And then the attempt, and this is really happening in Australia as well. Funnily enough, in this internet world, the mainstream media seem utterly obsessed with American politics. And the attempt to portray a left-wing Scottish Presbyterian as a right-wing American Republican, smearing by association, is pathetic. But that's what happens all the time, that you just, people accuse you of that, and again, it's something I've come across in Australia. I don't want to say anything derogatory about my American friends, but I'm not a redneck American Republican. And yet, if I uphold the view that the Pope holds on marriage, for example, apparently I am. So it's lazy journalism, it's cheap, it's nasty, and it's bigoted and prejudiced.
You get relegated one side or the other, which is a really powerful thought, because there's actually not that many alternatives. If you hold to a Christian ethic, you're likely to be categorized as you're describing today. But the alternative, if you say, I'm not going to hold to those Christian ethics any longer, the likelihood is you're going to be drawn to a Marxist ethic, and there's not that many other, and you might say, I don't want to hold into any of those, but this is where you're drawn. And so even in your article, you suggest that nameless cultural Marxists seem to have taken over most of Scotland's main systems. So when you neglect your Christian ethic, this is your choice, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think in the Western world especially, I think what has been termed the long march through the institutions. Now, the Christian commentator Os Guinness, who's one of the smartest men in the world, recently had an interview with the ARC, I think it's called, in London. And he did a brilliant interview with someone called Winston, who used to be in a rock band. And he talked about growing up in China and the communists coming to power. He's quite old, Oz, and he wouldn't mind me saying that. But one of the things he points out is how this is not classical communism or Marxism anymore. This is cultural Marxism. And I'm afraid that's predominant in our universities. It's predominant in much of our media. People get really annoyed if you use the phrase. They say you're exaggerating. But look, when people in Columbia University start putting up tents inside in order to protest against Israel and for Hamas, that soon you can guarantee that's going to happen in Melbourne and in Sydney and elsewhere, because the same ethos of cultural Marxism where everyone has the same point of view about every single social issue and follow the same pattern, that's going to happen. So you're right. I mean, I think the fundamental choice in the Western world today is, are we going to hold to a Christian ethos, or are we going to have a cultural Marxist ethos? Or in some areas, you want to say, are we going to have Islamic ethos? Because that's a big issue in Europe. There are 1 million Muslims in Australia, and I was reading in the paper today that the Labour Party is really struggling because they want to keep them on board, and so probably the government's policy towards Israel may well change. So I think those are the three major worldviews that we face at the moment. Incidentally, can I just add to that, say in the Hindu, there are a lot of welcome Indian immigrants in Australia and in Scotland as well, and the Indian Council of Scotland and the United Kingdom have put out a statement saying that they are disgusted at the way that Kate Forbes has been treated. They say this, I love this: she is, in our view, doing her utmost as a devout Christian to adhere to the teachings of her Saviour. And they say this great line: her mother and father laboured as devout Scottish Christians in India, and they were grateful for that as Indians. He said, sadly, it appears their talented daughter is not allowed to express her faith in her native land. I just thought that's lovely. That's the real multiculturalism. That, you know, you've got the Hindu Indians defending the Scottish Protestant and saying, guys, chill out, to the atheist secularists. I thought that was beautiful.
When everyone has their say, then it all becomes quite complex in the way that then you need to somehow rather let those things settle so that you understand your own position. Because the criticism is towards her Christianity, that she couldn't at all, being a Christian, represent Scotland in all its diversity. And in your article, you're suggesting actually it's probably the opposite, that when you do hold a Christian ethic, you probably are going to be the best person to be able to solve all of those issues of balance.
Yeah, so, I mean, here's another issue that's coming in Scotland. So this is a real key part of what I was trying to argue. And I would say this, that if you are a Christian, there are things that you would consider to be immoral and wrong, but you wouldn't seek to impose or punish by the state. So, for example, I think sexual immorality is wrong, but I wouldn't go around jailing all adulterers. Otherwise, Australia just wouldn't have enough room in any of its prisons. You know, we'd have to take over the whole of Tasmania or something. So, I mean, we don't do that. But the trouble is, if you reject God, you replace the state with God, and therefore anything that's wrong you must punish. So there are two issues here. One is the Welsh Parliament has decided it's going to pass a law which bans politicians from lying. Well, good luck with that one. The law itself will be a lie. And secondly, you know, here in Australia, we are rightly concerned about the horrendous amount of domestic violence that there is. But the notion that the government can pass a law and abolish domestic violence, or just spend enough money and it will be dealt with. The government can spend money to alleviate some of the things that happen. The government can spend money to help in education. But if any politician says, we are going to abolish domestic violence, no, you're not. You need to recognize it's a problem of the human heart. It's a problem of human relationships. And you need something far more powerful than a political law or even state police to deal with that. They can be tools, but they don't get the heart. And I think that actually is the heart of the issue here. People in the SNP in Scotland, if they want Scottish independence and a better society, they would elect Kate Forbes as their leader. But they're so obsessed with this kind of green progressive ideology that they're prepared to sacrifice independence in order to stop a Christian having any kind of power. It's astonishing.
Let's bring this into our Australian context here. Are we at risk of heading down that same pathway? Is Scotland here a little ahead of the game here, and they've got some controversies that we could see brewing beneath the surface here in Australia?
Oh, totally. So I'll not name the radio station, but there are views that become unacceptable. And there's a radio station here in Australia where a producer contacted me and said, basically, I'd love to have you on, but I don't think it would be permissible. Now, there's no hate speech involved. There's no breaking the law. But just there are people you can't have that person on. You must not. And the same thing happens in politics. So in the United Kingdom, I know people who were standing for the Conservative Party, who were intending to stand as prospective politicians, and they were vetted, and they were, because of the fact that they belong to a particular church, they were told, no, you can't. And I think there's a danger of people reacting by becoming, reactionary right-wing. There's a danger that people react by becoming reactionary left-wing. But the greatest danger of all, I think, is simply this, that those of us who hold to a biblical morality, in other words, too extreme to have a place in the public square. And what people will say is, have your beliefs, but it's like joining a knitting club or a line dancing club or a Trekkie club. Keep it to yourself, do it behind closed doors. Don't ever put it on the media or in public life, and certainly don't bring it into your politics. And that's the way it's going. And I think in Australia there is a danger. We're not there yet, but I think there's a real danger we could go that way.
Well, cancel culture is one of those things that we've been monitoring along. And I'm very interested, the fact that you have reported this Kenny Farquharson for a hate crime. Now, you're doing something which some have said, well, why can't Christians report hate crime as well? Because it seems to be everybody accuses Christians of all sorts of hate speech and such things. But when religion is the reason for hateful speech, do you think it's quite then relevant for Christians to report these things when they come to light?
I personally think that hate speech is a ridiculous idea, and monitoring people's speech in that way. I think there are already laws against you inciting people to violence, but hate speech is in the eye of the beholder, and that's the problem. So why have I done this? I think it's ridiculous. Well, basically, I use the devil's own weapons against him, basically. That's my, sure, that's the game you want to play, that's fine. Well, in Scottish law, if someone perceives it as being a hate crime, it has to be investigated by the police. And I'll actually encourage loads of people to report it, because I do think saying someone cannot be First Minister of Scotland, even though they're the most talented person, because of their Christianity, is hate speech. I really do, actually. I mean, I will argue against it and show the absurdity of it and publish and all the rest of it. But given the law of the land, I feel I'm perfectly entitled to use that law and say, okay, this is hate speech, you better investigate it.
And one last thing, because time is short, how you resolve these things for the future. And you're calling Christian believers to pray for leaders. You reflect on Saul on the road to Damascus and a Damascus Road experience that turned around his whole ethos as a leader. This is something you're calling Christians, if you're looking for solutions, this is one way to begin to pray, and prayer is powerful.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I pray for the journalist, Kenny Farquharson. It's a nasty, horrible piece. But Saul was a nasty, horrible man who went around killing Christians, and God turned him into Paul, who planted lots of churches. People say, what good does all that do? Well, I can tell you, I used to be in very vicious debates with the president of the Scottish Secular Society. He's now a believer. And he is a friend, and we keep in touch with one another. He's completely turned around. And I think that wasn't, my wonderful persuasive arguments. I think it was just simply prayer and God changing him through circumstances and various other things. And we pray exactly the same. That's why we should always pray. You may not like Anthony Albanese, pray for him. You may not like Peter Dutton, pray for him. Or whoever is in charge in your state, pray for them. Pray for Chris Minns. I think his father or mother died recently, yesterday. And, we pray for all these people because we know it's only God can change the heart. I said already that the laws are not going to change domestic violence. We need God to change violent people's hearts. And we also need God to change the hearts and minds of our politicians and media commentators.
Well, some listeners might want to follow through and read the latest article that is now gone viral in different countries around the world, written by David Robertson. You'll be able to find it at christiantoday.com. Look for the link about Kate Forbes in Scotland. You can also connect with David at his website, theweeflea.com. theweeflea.com. David Robertson writes for newspapers, magazines. You're the author of a number of books, including The Dawkins Letters and Engaging with Atheists. Your latest book is called Seek. David, thanks so much for another great update today on 2020.
It's a joy being with you as always.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.